So, welcome everyone, and thank you, Anneka, for that great introduction. My name is Cvitan Brkic, and today I'm going to be presenting to you the title "Collective Bargaining and to Right to Strike in the Public Sector." Now, before I go into the actual portion of the part of my presentation today, we need to peel back the onion a little bit when it comes to the collective bargaining right to strike and how we get to that point today. So we have to start off with the actual labor legislation, the Canadian labor legislation that was entrenched within the Canadian labor market. And that was originally entrenched in 1907 under the Industrial Dispute Investigations Act, and in 1948 under the Industrial Relations and Dispute Act. Now, I split this off into two key areas, the private sector and the public sector. In the private sector itself, it was through the Collective Bargaining Act in 1943, but also was indoctrined through the Privacy Council of PC 1003, and also the Wagner Act of 1935. And that was the entrenchment of labor relations that started moving forward in Canada. From a public sector perspective, it actually passed legislation of collective bargaining between 1965 and 1975. And that also included federal government employees and also provincial governments to allow employees to collective bargaining. Now, from the perspective when it comes to government itself, government between 1965 and 1975 also at that time, while half the provinces granted that right to strike in some shape or form, the other half, which included Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta, denied the right for government employees under any circumstances to actually have that right to strike and resolve that impasse through the resolution of interest arbitration. Now, how is it in effect today to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? Now, today, as everybody is aware, is that it is entrenched now through Section 2D of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is part of our freedom of association and our under fundamental freedoms. But also, it also has to be entrenched through the guaranteed rights and freedoms under Section 1 of the Charter. Now, with that, there is 5 fundamental things to when I go through this presentation today, is the concept of the Section 1 of the Charter. It has to meet thresholds. First of all, it has to meet the balance of probabilities, which includes it has to be a pressing and substantive objective. The second part to that, it has to be rationally connected to the achievement of those objectives. What is objective 2? Right to collective bargaining and the right to strike. The third one, to ensure that it minimally impairs the affected right of collective bargaining and the right to strike. And then lastly, through the harmful effects, through the measurements that don't outweigh the benefits. And with that being said, when I talk about Section 1 of the Charter, I'm also talking about including the Oakes test. That has to be a fundamental area that we have to include today as part of when we're talking about the collective bargaining and the right to strike. Now, with that being said, the first trilogy that comes from this perspective is the first area of the test to collective bargaining and the right to strike, and that was the 1987 Alberta reference. This reference was a constitutional reference to the Public Service Employee Relations Act. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to, in this case, try to challenge the collective bargaining and right to strike notion. However, in the Supreme Court decision, as part of the Alberta reference, it actually was rejected. It rejected that notion in a 6-2 decision. As they mentioned, that it did not constitute the constitutional protections to the right to collective bargaining and the right to strike. And what they were saying as part of this decision was that they felt that this was only to protect the individual. This was not deemed part to collective rights, since the individuals could not collectively bargain in the workplace without having having access to collective bargaining and the right to strike. As such, they were both fundamental rights. So just from that perspective, this first trilogy of the 1987 Alberta reference is a key principle to what will happen going forward. And this was actually a challenge also to when we're talking about during that time frame, when Canada Post back in 1987 under the Postal Service Continuation Act also tried to challenge during that same time. And again, it was struck down as when the union tried to file this constitutional challenge. It was struck down as because of the fact that, again, it was not it's the collective bargaining and the right to strike was an individual right, not a collective right. But 28 years later, it took 28 years until 2015 that the change to the freedom of association, the right to collective bargaining, with the right to strike, was actually put in and entrenched through the Saskatchewan, through the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor case and the BC Health Services case, which was then a retreat from the Alberta reference altogether. Now, this is where I call it the second trilogy. The second trilogy, the case with the Saskatchewan Federation of Labor versus Saskatchewan. And this was a challenge by the union in 2007. They challenged the two statutes, the Public Service Essential Services Act of 2008 and the Trade Union Amendment Act of 2008. The unions challenged that the constitutionality of the legislation in both Section 2D and then within Section 1 of the Charter. Now, some of the things that came from that is that when it was originally put in, when they originally challenged the legislation, the Court of Appeal originally upheld that decision and they deemed it dismissed. But when it was brought to the Supreme Court of Canada, there was a 5-2 decision that ruled that it actually violated the right to collective bargaining and the right to strike under Section 2D of the Charter. One of the things, just to kind of bring in perspective, that was mentioned as part of the decision and was made known is that Democratic elected officials are responsible to determine the economic and social interests in the area of labor relations. It is the role of the actual legislator, not the judges, to balance competing tensions in making policy decisions in the areas of social economic policy. And that you can tie into the perspective of talking about the concept of judicial restraint versus judicial activism. And from that perspective, this was the landmark to this decision when it came to the right to collective bargaining and the right to strike. It's been used consistently today in decisions when the actual when unions are challenging legislation. This has been an imperative piece that is used as part of the decision itself. Now, when we're talking about the trilogy and we're talking about how this impacted, I talk about the actual part to public sector bargaining, and I'm talking about two pieces of legislation not too long ago, within the past 4 to 5 years, that we have had the actual attack to the right to collective bargaining and the right to strike. And the first one that I'm going to go into is Bill 124. Bill 124, the Protecting of the Sustainable Public Sector for Future Generations Act. What this did is, and this part of this legislative aspect, was that it was trying to limit salary increases of 1% of the moderation period of the act. And with that, it actually infringed on Section 2D of the Charter, where the Supreme Court of Canada already ruled back in 2015 that it provided protections to collective bargaining and the right to strike as part of the freedom of association under Section 2D. In the decision, the 81-page decision that was provided as part of the decision by Judge Cohen, he mentioned as part of the government tried to respond back to say that there were budgetary restraints to implement that legislation, but Section 1 did not hold that. It did. Judge Cohen said that it does budgetary considerations could not be held under Section 1 of the Charter, as it constitute pressing and substantive issues. Now, one other thing that this was very important in that decision, when we're talking about Bill 124, is the fact that he mentioned that when the government took that position of actually of paying wages, not paying wages above the 1%, he reluctantly said, he says, well, because the government didn't take that position, right? They felt that the government was, by not doing that, it would have led to strikes. And one of the things that he brought to this perspective is that by imposing that 1% wage increase, right? The government feared by taking that position to the bargaining table will lead employees to exercise their constitutionally protected right to strike. And in this instance, it did not amount to any reasonable limit to the right to collective bargaining that could be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So this was one of the first decisions from a public sector standpoint, from the perspective that we have seen, that they tried to impose legislation. And one of the key aspects that I'll speak to a little bit later on is that Canada Post 2016 decision, in which and this was going back to when the Canada Postal Workers striked in 2011, this had that same effect, in which it happened in 2016, in the decision in 2016 as well. And they in fact, with Canada Post, it went through that same process. But I will explain more of that later on. But the second part to this is Bill 28. Now, Bill 28 is the Keeping in Students in Class Act that was passed last year on October 31st, 2022. Now, one of the things with Bill 28, which seemingly that to understand why this is important and why it attacks that collective bargaining right to strike in the public sector, is the fact that they used the notwithstanding clause, Section 33 of the Charter. And when they were using the Charter as a section of Section 33, they tried to infringe on rights under Section 2, Section 7, Section 15 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, more formally towards Section 2 of the Charter of the Fundamental Rights. And everything was done with the union. They gave their 5-day notice. They issued that notice, and then the following day they went to pass it in the legislature. And this Bill 28, using the one notwithstanding clause, was only used once before, and that was part of the Saskatchewan Government Employee Union Dispute Settlement Act of 1986. From that perspective, that was the only time Section 33 was used to dispute in terms of the right to collective bargaining and right to strike. The key piece and fundamental aspect to this, when you're using back to work legislation, especially when a strike has already started and they've already given that 5-day notice, Bill 28, what it did, it pushed back other back to work legislation. They tried to prevent a strike before even a strike happened. They tried to impose severe fines for the union and its members for exercising their constitutionally protected right to strike, and unilaterally imposed a new collective agreement. And this was unheard of by using that notwithstanding clause. You took away not only that the Charter protected rights under those sections, Section 2, Section 7, Section 15, you also took away the aspects of the Interior Human Rights Code as well. And this is why when we look at these two cases overall, these two cases were the fundamental, I call a fundamental attack to the constitutional right to bargain and the right to strike. But given those two aspects in itself, there has been this spillover effect to private sector bargaining. And why I mentioned these two cases is it's very important to understand. The first one is the Air Canada strike that happened in 2011. Now, in 2011, the Air Canada strike, they had two strikes simultaneously in 2011. One was with the call center workers and the agents that were working there. But the second one, which I was going to talk to more, is the fact that it affected the Air Canada flight attendants. And the biggest thing to this is that the government of the day tried to force back to work legislation to them even before the strike was going to begin. And the position always with when we're talking about how it's politically driven from a government perspective, they were using the whole aspect of actually trying to make this as an essential service. Also, they tried to, in that instance, make wanting to have the actual government saying this is a Canadian economy issue. So they're trying to impose that will on the union with the Air Canada strike. So just to kind of give you that part to that effect as well. So just to let you know, and this also happened this year with the PC port worker strike as well. Now, I just wanted to bring into context, just to kind of let you know from that perspective, is that the back to work legislation has had his will to that perspective. And it also entrenches to what happened in the graphic you see below due to the strikes and lockouts that happened over time from the time frame. The most important piece to this perspective, and when we're talking about labor relations and talking about labor disruptions, it can have economic and social impacts, and it can do things such as reduce economic output, lower earning for workers, and increase social tensions. And this is one of the important things, especially when we're talking about having issues when we're talking about collective bargaining and the right to strike, and how that fits that dynamic as well. Now, this part to me is always important as well when we're talking about the government of Ontario and basically the right to strike and collective bargaining and how it's been effective. And what I'm showing here as part of the charts here is the actual trend of what's happening due to the actual aspect of that Bill 124 wage restraint and how it affected things such as the wage increases and how it affects people's living conditions and when we're talking about collective bargaining. And one of the things from this perspective when we're talking about it is say that for the job vacancies, for example, there's been an increase of job vacancies within the Ontario public sector. And this is in regards to Bill 124. But also this has a dramatic effect to such as inflation. Inflation increased the rates of that as well, of collective bargaining. And the second part to that is that it actually impacted with Bill 124 into perspective when it comes to the right to strike and collective bargaining. And with that being said, it actually is going to cost, because of this way, when it was constitutionally struck down this year, it's going to cost the government $8.4 billion because of what they have tried to do to restrain it. And that's one just example from that perspective, but also it also provides the context is how it's been differentiated when they're negotiating, when you do have a right to strike to collective agreements as well. So just a couple of the key recommendations to this standpoint, just to kind of know what they can do to avoid this perspective when we're talking about the collective bargaining and the right to strike in the public sector. One, it should use a common approach to collective bargaining and the right to strike. There are many avenues and ways in terms of how to resolve issues without using the right to in terms of using such thing as back to work legislation, the notwithstanding clause. There is other mechanisms such as the ADR, alternate dispute resolutions. There's mediation, there's arbitration, there's conciliation, and we're trying to and that is one of the things that they should be honing home, because we've seen this from the perspective from that being it's more militant and more more striking to use that tool instead of using that common approach. The second recommendation I have here is having access to greater data when we're talking about public sector compensation. This would include a comparative analysis to private sector compensation of wage and non-wage benefits. And the reason for that, and to mention is, it's important, especially when we're talking about collective bargaining and the right to strike. This would help, and phase the fact that, if you have the data involved, and especially we're talking about things like inflation and interest rates, those are the things that, from that perspective, those are the parts that need to be included. And when we're looking at real data, that is one of the more important things as well. And lastly, the creation of a sectoral bargaining approach to collective bargaining. And we're looking at an example like Sweden, which use the actual formula to sectoral bargaining, especially when we're talking about unionized workers. Sweden has over 70% unionized workers within that area, which is actually more than in Canada. They actually have half of what Canada's unionized labor force has. So that approach would do a lot of things. It would reduce the wage gaps. It will bring it will collectively have bargaining that is uniformed through all areas, but also it would also ensure that there is that sort of pattern bargaining, but it's entrenched. I know that there is some dissective areas where they have it, but this would be a more collective approach, bringing that sectoral bargaining approach to that. And that would include strengthening or reform the labor laws. We need to kind of ensure that those labor laws need to be more conducive when it comes from that perspective. So that is this is my presentation today, and I'd like to thank everyone for listening to the collective bargaining and the right to strike. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to present here today. My research is titled Negotiating Homeland and Statelessness, Sri Lankan Repatriates, Rehabilitation and Kerala's Rubber Estates. The study looks at the living and working conditions of plantation laborers in Sri Lanka who were repatriated back to India and rehabilitated in rubber estates in Kerala. So just to sort of give you an overview of what this issue is about. Ceylon, as Sri Lanka was called back then, was established as a British colony in the year 1802. So the British undertook large-scale cultivation of cash crops in the region, especially tea and coffee. So due to the shortage of local laborers to work in these plantations, they started hiring laborers from this region in India called Tamil Nadu. The sort of labor migration started initially as seasonal migration to these plantations. And over time, the laborers started settling in within the estates and working there for generations to come. So as you can imagine, the working conditions in plantations were pretty harsh. There were economic and legal coercion, surveillance, and soft social mechanisms being employed on them. And especially these laborers were sort of bound to the territorial area of the plantation itself. Just to point out that the group that I am studying is the Indian origin Tamils. They are not the same community as the Sri Lankan Tamils. You might know the Sri Lankan Tamils from the Sri Lankan Civil War. So these two are two different communities, and their integration never happened, even though they speak the same language. Primarily because Indian origin Tamils were working in plantations, and they were spatially and economically separated from the rest of the population of the country. So fast forward a few years, Sri Lanka becomes independent in the year 1948, and they pass a Citizenship Act the same year, which denies citizenship to these plantation laborers. While all other ethnic minorities are given naturalized citizenship, these plantation laborers are asked to prove their descent. Since their parents had migrated from India long back, I don't know, 200 years before this law came into place, they did not have any documents to show, and hence overnight 11% of the population of the country becomes stateless. So there was a lot of provisional agreements between the Indian and Sri Lankan governments to try and find a solution to this issue and grant citizenship to these people. Finally, in 1964 and 1974, there are two pacts between the Indian and Sri Lankan government to provide citizenship to the plantation workers. So the idea is that India would give citizenship to a certain number of plantation workers, and Ceylon or Sri Lanka would give citizenship to the rest. So my study focuses only on the repatriates who are now living in rubber estates in Kerala. So 15 workers from the Rehabilitation Plantation Limited, belonging to two estates called Ayiranallur and Kulathapuzha in Kollam district of Kerala, were interviewed for this process. And all of them were descendants of laborers who repatriated back to India in 1970s. All these research was conducted in the year 2020-21. So all interviews were conducted through telephonic conversations. So the rehabilitation process was fairly simple. Each family was given a family card containing all information about their family members and a passport to come to India. Once they were in India, they were housed in a camp for around 2 to 3 months before being rehabilitated elsewhere. So they were given two options to be rehabilitated. One is that they could choose to be rehabilitated into a different plantation of the government's choosing, and two members from each of their family would get a job to work there, or they could get a sum of around 40,000 Indian rupees and a few acres of land to start agriculture or business or whatever they prefer. Most laborers that I interviewed belong to backward castes, also class and scheduled caste and scheduled tribe groups. Along with the rehabilitation, they were also given 1 staff quarters per family to live and work in these plantations. Currently, a rubber tapper is a person who collects the latex from the rubber, gets around 510 Indian rupees per day as a daily wage, which is approximately $7 for a day's work. While there has been an increase in wages for these workers, it is still not sufficient for them to carry out their day-to-day needs. Laborers are still, to this day, housed in the same labor quarters as they were moved into in the 1970s, which are roofed with asbestos. So in the 70s, asbestos was a very popular construction material because of how easily it was available. As some of you might know, that asbestos is now, due to a lot of studies done in this area, is called as a silent killer due to its effects on human health and well-being. It causes cancer. If you inhale asbestos air for a long time, it can cause cancer. So the people still continue to live in these houses, and there are concerns regarding the health of the workers, especially with rising temperature levels in the area. So here is a short anecdote from one of the conversations that I've had with these laborers. Most of the quarters are the same as they were built when we came here. Now our families have grown bigger and cannot fit all of us in these tiny spaces. We still live in asbestos houses, which is causing a lot of health issues for us, and it becomes practically inhabitable to live here during summer seasons. There are also other issues within the current plantation system that these people were rehabilitated into. First of all is job mobility. It is practically impossible for a rubber tapper to become a supervisor or a line manager in their area of work, primarily because there is no provision to do so. So if your parents were rubber tappers, it's most likely that you are also going to work as a rubber tapper in these plantations. There is also increasing casualization of labor, whereby permanent jobs in the plantations are only awarded to people who were born in Sri Lanka. So if you were born in India, you can only be employed as a casual laborer and will not get the same benefits as a permanent rubber tapper in that region. Even after 40 years of rehabilitation, the workers have not made considerable material progress to be able to move out of these plantation system and make a life of their own. Having said that, it is not to say that the state has not played an important role in ensuring social protection and measures for the benefit of the workers, but there is still a huge gap in what the workers want and what the state is providing them. So what can we do about this? These are some of the suggestions that the workers themselves came up with in the conversations that we had during my research. First of all, even though there are social protection measures in place, such as pension benefits and education for their children and primary health care, it is still so far from being what the worker wants. So there needs to be more effort put in by the state to improve social protection measures for these repatriate workers to continue their lives. The state also needs to proactively ensure that minimum wages and daily wages of these workers are improved, and the working conditions and quarters of these laborers are bettered. So they have to change their housing quarter situation, replace their asbestos houses, and build new ones, which of course is a huge responsibility on the state itself. Thirdly, learning and development initiatives so that workers can have access to upward mobility in their work. So if somebody wants to be a supervisor or a line manager in their line of work, there should be learning and development initiatives that promote this and that gives them the opportunity to have access to these spaces and move forward in their line of work. Finally, with regards to casualization of work and job opportunities in the plantations, since more and more, at this point, nobody is being born in Sri Lanka and everyone's being born in India. So at the end of the day, everybody is being employed as a casual laborer in the plantations. So the state needs to bring in more policies to ensure job security of these workers and provide them with better contracts and better long-standing work, and rather than casually being employed for around 21 days in a month, and depending on the produce season. So having said that, I would also like to acknowledge the fact that the state played an important role initially during the rehabilitation period, whereby they were given opportunity to start their life again when it was all uprooted overnight. However, following the real trend that once you rehabilitate a community, you don't look back at them and think about how they're doing and what their needs are. The same case happened here. So it is not only important for these workers, state intervention is not only important for them to improve their living conditions, but also move away from this sort of a plantation system where they're bound to the territorial boundaries of the plantation, both physically, also socially and economically. So it is, I would like to stress on the importance of how this intervention in policy and by action is important in this sort of mobility of the workers, both socio-economical and political mobility of the workers. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you want.
Awesome, thank you, Parvati. So now we'll move on to Sahar.
Yeah, my presentation is about the culture of ignorance in neoliberalism, examining the blame game and individual responsibility. It's basically, my paper comes into two parts. In the first part, I discuss the ideological side of neoliberalism in Western world, and I explain how ignorance in policy making through Jacqueline Best's ideas. Best basically describes type of economic ignorance that characterized the policy-making process in 1980s. And these forms of ignorance led to disaster in the political economy of countries such as UK and US, and their continued application has contributed to further inequality and chronic economic crisis. She basically categorizes this type of behavior, ignorant behavior in policymaking, into four categories. The first one is wishful and magical thinking, which is the art of ignoring how ridiculous an idea is. The second one is cluelessness, which is genuine confusion about what is happening, especially when a ridiculous idea doesn't work. The third one is fudging and modeling through, which is doing what one can to make one's magical thinking seem more believable in spite of cluelessness. And the fourth one is denial, which is blissfully ignoring all such contradiction and disparities between theory and reality and pretending that it is the fault of some other person, agency, or group when things go wrong. Then I have explained in the level of ideology how Western neoliberalism deviate the blame and basically how these types of ignorant behavior lead to victim blaming. According to Adam Katsko, neoliberal policymaking purposefully ignore the inequality generated by government system they support and promote, and instead shift the blame for their dysfunction onto those negatively affected by such systems, typically by criminalizing selected individual and population. The language that neoliberal ideology relies on in practice to promote ignorance can be defined by Frankfurt terms as bullshitting. In Frankfurt definition, bullshit is a type of language used to persuade others without regard for truth or accuracy, as opposed to lying, which is a deliberate attempt to deceive. The concept of bullshit can be linked to neoliberalism in numbers of ways. One significant connection is to the idea that neoliberalism is characterized both in theory and practice by a disinterested focus on market efficiency and generation of profit as public goods. A focus that arises out of a concern for truth and accuracy in economic thinking. Taking this for granted and ignoring the role of neoliberalism in defining and shaping the politics of economic crisis management can lead to promotion of policies or practices that are not based on sound evidence or data, but instead ignore context, deny contradiction, and privilege bad actors, policies and practices that are presented in ways intended to persuade or impress reductively and emotionally. And then I came into second part, which is I discussed wishful thoughts, willful ignorance, and ideological subject in labor law in Iran. I have explained in this part how the complication of governing systems brings about different explanation about the governing system in Iran in general. The political economic situation in Iran is the result of two major forces that play on both class and gender divides in Iranian society. On the one hand, there is the influence of a world economic system that operates in terms of neoliberalism and austerity as modes of ideological and policy crisis management. On the other hand, a local, that is national and regional political economic system, including states and para-state forces that are militarized and polarized. I also explained the importance of examples of ideology-driven and in labor law in Iran. Since the revolution, the Islamic Republic has closely monitored the labor force using government-controlled ideology-driven unions called Islamic Labor Councils and assemblies of workers' representatives for business with fewer than 35 employees, for example. These labor councils are overseen by the Workers' House, a labor organization that was originally secular but was taken over by pro-regime factions after the revolution. To operate legally, all councils must obtain official recognition from the Workers' House, otherwise they face the risk of being shut down. Both the Labor Council and assemblies of workers' representatives are aligned with Supreme Leader and the ruling conservative faction in Iran. What Adam Katsko called reversing blame, demonizing individuals or selected groups not responsible for an economic crisis but who suffers its effect, is often closely related to the notion of security in Iran. The more extensive the realm of privatization becomes and the more it imposes social strain, the more austerity policies have been accompanied by what justified as security measures. In security states, political and intelligence elites, along with police forces and militaries promote a security discourse articulating hegemonies in terms of the provision of safety and stability rather than welfare. According to Tara Povey, one key aspect of the neoliberal trajectory in Iran has been militarization. In particular, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has become the major beneficiary of privatization and the selling off of billions of dollars of states assets. It is important to note that the IRGC is known as the most ideologically committed organ of the government. In this section, I have also talked about some of the ignorant decision-making and its consequences in Iranian labor law. Ignorant decision-making, which was a mixture of wishful thinking, fudging, puzzling, and denial, was prevalent. Example of this decision included eliminating government subsidies, granting interest-free loans to department sectors, and increasing inequality, which have all contributed to a more acute economic situation. However, instead of examining this economics structure critically, policymakers and responsible individuals in government have only shifted the blame without taking an effective action. And at the end, I have proposed this question that if individual blames is so interwoven with neoliberalism, whether individual responsibility has place in resisting it and how it should be defined. I gave two answers to it, which might look obvious. Actually, besides activism-related answer, one can also consider day-to-day perpetuation of ignorance by individual in relation to others, which can be traced back to privilege. Neoliberalism as a system and culture of ignorance has resulted in the reconfiguration of class structures and the emergence of forms of inequality, including in everyday life. Another aspect of individual responsibility involves increasing our understanding of political language. For instance, Neumann suggests strategies for recognizing political bullshit as a form of speech that aims to direct or obfuscate in order to elicit an emotional response, often resulting in irrational decision-making. Thank you, everybody. Now I am open to questions.
Yeah, so we'll hold the questions to the end, but thank you, Sahar. And now we have Adam.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Anneka, for the introduction. As Anneka mentioned, my name is Adam Zvric, and I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Labor Studies at McMaster University. And indeed, as the title slide alludes to, the focus of my research is essentiality during the COVID-19 pandemic. And before I begin, I would like to ask you to reflect on what is essential. What do we mean when we say something is essential? Well, you might be thinking that's an unfair question. In order to decide what's essential, we have to know what it is in relation to. And that's a fair point. Indeed, in order for something to be essential, it has to be essential to something. Water and food are essential to survival. Oxygen is essential to life. Family and friends are, most of the time, essential to well-being. So then how should we understand essential work? What is it essential to? Well, this is a question that governments grappled with, including the Canadian federal government and provincial government here in Ontario at the onset of the pandemic. I'm sure we all recall the vast list of essential work released here in Ontario. And indeed, at the federal level, Public Safety Canada released guidance for the provinces on what should be considered essential throughout the pandemic. And as you can see here, that guidance sought to define work, what work needed to be essential to, defining it as essential to the health, safety, security, or economic well-being of Canadians and the effective functioning of government. And that might sound like a completely rational and sound definition. However, it still leaves a lot of questions around exactly what work should be considered essential. And this is what sparked the research question for this paper. In particular, how are we to understand the nature of essential work during the pandemic? More specifically, how was essentiality able to subsume what prior to the pandemic had largely been viewed as low wage, low prestige, and often racialized work? If you think about it, while in pre-COVID times, we might have thought of doctors, nurses, emergency services, maybe even the military as essential, but suddenly grocery store clerks, temporary factory workers, delivery drivers, just to name a few, were considered essential, pandemic heroes, frontline workers. What my question sought to explore was what explains this vast and incredibly quick expansion of what we consider essential work. And in order to start to explore this question, I decided to situate my research using critical political economy, and in particular, use the regulation school approach that situates analysis within the contradictions of the capitalist social system. And in terms of a conceptual framework, I borrowed and adapted a framework developed by Bob Jessup that seeks to conceptualize a political economy, which you can see outlined here. Having settled on a framework, I then undertook a literature review to understand and identify the various policies, logics, and discourses, or what can be referred to as fixes, that have maintained what has, since the 1980s, been a neoliberal financial mode of accumulation in the Canadian context. And you can see those various fixes here. Taken together, the sum of these fixes represents what, in part, maintains the neoliberal economic system in Canada, or in other words, the glue holding the system together. That was until COVID-19. Indeed, the onset of the pandemic and the enacting of public health measures that were required to stem the contagion of the virus would create crises within every single one of these fixes. In literally a matter of days, the glue that had developed to hold the economic system together for over 4 decades was suddenly frayed. From this point of crisis, I could now start to explore the role of essentiality as a fix itself to these crises. I did this in particular through examining various policies at the federal and provincial level, as well as the Bank of Canada and reports from Statistics Canada that invoked or used essentiality. And through this analysis, I could begin to piece together the ways in which essentiality was used to broach the threats to these fixes. For instance, in regard to financial capital, the entire financial sector was designated as essential at both the federal and provincial levels. This ensured that the work required to enable the movement of international finance would continue. However, more importantly, this acted as justification for huge interventions from the Bank of Canada to prop up the financial sector using discourse of essentiality. Similarly, industrial capital could resume production through specific designations of essentiality. In particular, the guidance on essentiality at the federal level would include businesses that, quote, ensure global continuity of supply and that support supply chains in Canada. Made more explicit in the policy issued by the Government of Ontario, these would include all businesses that, quote, support the two-way movement of essential goods within integrated North American and global supply chains. But after decades of neoliberal globalization, virtually all production is in some way or another linked to global supply chains. Furthermore, being designated as an essential worker, or being designated an essential business, meant that the workers within that workplace were simultaneously deemed essential workers, effectively maintaining a workforce required to carry out the work. And because their designation was as essential was a result of government regulation, this meant that the upward pressure on wages would be borne by the state and not the companies. However, these essential workers also had to be restricted from leaving the labor force altogether without necessarily receiving incentives to stay, which would further make the cost of labor more expensive. Thus, while temporary direct income transfers, such as the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, were used to both shore up demand and social reproduction, they were only available to those that had not, quote, voluntarily left their job. In other words, they excluded essential workers whose workplaces were not forced to shut. Essentiality would also serve an important discursive purpose for the state. Reference to essential workers would allow for the reframing of public discourse away from competition and personal responsibility to one of solidarity, lending legitimacy and public buy-in for government policies. The thanking of essential workers, those on the front lines, and the heroes keeping society functioning would become commonplace in press briefings and news releases by government officials. However, this gratitude was often followed by ways in which larger society could repay these essential workers, namely by following the public health measures mandated by the government and accepting that the work designated as essential was indeed just that, essential. In truth, what was demonstrated through this analysis was, in the context of the global market, what was essential to economic well-being was the maintenance of neoliberal globalization. And indeed, this served as the foundation of economic well-being on which essentiality was built. So in order to ensure this maintenance, essentiality as a fix really did fit the mold. So what does all this demonstrate? Well, first Firstly, that essentiality was an extremely useful and malleable fix to many of the crises fixed within the Canadian political economy during the onset of COVID-19. It was, however fragile, able to keep the neoliberal economic system together, which justified its expansive use across a wide range of industries and work, including low-wage work. But more than this, by framing essentiality and economic well-being within a system that has for decades sought to limit the cost and power of labor, this meant that it was really the continuation of the work that was essential, not the worker. Indeed, the worker now working in the context of COVID-19 was, in reality, expendable. And this came at a serious cost. Indeed, according to WSIB claims, the highest fatalities from COVID-19 among essential workers were among factory workers, including those manufacturing such goods as chewing gum and cosmetics. This was the cost paid for maintaining economic well-being. Given this, and as we move into the post-pandemic period, what will be the legacy of essentiality going forward? And here I can see two seemingly contradictory potentials. One is that essentiality becomes a source of control by the state and capital. If, as was the case during the pandemic, these workers and their work are considered essential to economic well-being, then it provides a logic to restrict these workers' rights to collective action. Indeed, at the end of last year, we saw the extent to which the state was willing to go in Ontario with the invocation of the notwithstanding clause to limit collective bargaining rights of some public workers, as Cvitan reviewed earlier. But following this logic, we can see how this justification of essentiality could be employed throughout both the public and private sectors. It's set on the backdrop of economic well-being in the context of neoliberal globalization. What is essential is to maintain the system as it is. And we can see this exact justification outlined by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business during the recent port strikes in British Columbia. On the other hand, essentiality may also offer itself as a source of power for labor. And I say this not only in the sense that being deemed essential may be a means to increase bargaining power, but more than this, that the invocation of essentiality has the power to push workers to reassess their position and power within the economic system. Thus, I don't believe that it's a coincidence that we have seen a re-emboldening within the labor movement in Canada and elsewhere, but we have also witnessed different forms of resistance within the workforce, including, for instance, in the Great Resignation. As the president of the Canadian Labour Congress notes, quote, "The pandemic fundamentally altered the psyche of most workers who started to recognize the true value of their labor. And I would argue that essentiality played a role in that fundamental altering." So in conclusion, as has been demonstrated during the pandemic, the contradiction between labor and capital was laid bare. And while essentiality was a mean to temporarily fix this contradiction, it could also be a site along which contestation is focused going forward. Thank you.